Well, it looks to me like it's 2:30, so we should let this get this show on the road since we have limited time. Are y'all hearing me? Am I unmuted? Someone raised their hand. Okay, great. Thank you very much. I never trust these things after 2 years of doing this. Well, welcome to the second session of the 2022 Arkansas Historical Association's annual meeting. Arkansas Identities, the Arkansas History Series by the University of Arkansas. Our three fine panelists are three of the four people who recently published books in this relatively new series on Arkansas history. Kelly is going to do the honor of announcing each one of them, but allow me to introduce you to the series. I've been editing the series the last several years, but am very pleased to announce the addition of Kelly Jones as co-editor. We put our heads together and drafted a description of the series, and I will share some of that with you today. The series is dedicated to promoting fresh interpretations of our state and region's past, representing diverse approaches to the history of Arkansas, including the lenses of things like culture and environment and politics and gender and sexuality and race. When I started my graduate work at the University of Arkansas, well, I won't tell you when it was. Well, I may as well. It was 1980 at the University of California, San Diego. There were very few books on the history of Arkansas, much to my disappointment, because I wanted to do an Arkansas topic and I was living in California. Not only that, very few historians of the South included much, if anything, on the state in their studies of the South. Except for Texas and Missouri, you'd have thought that that Southern history ended at the Mississippi River. Well, all that changed with the creation of the U of A Press in 1980. Well, Arkansas is no longer an unstudied region, left out of the larger historiography on Native American history, on African American history, on the history of slavery, you name it. It remains a fertile field for historians. Not everything's been done yet. Scholars might test hypotheses about topics that fit the state in the mainstream, or for example, the New South, progressive, any one of a number of topics. Or there's plenty of room to explore topics that have been studied elsewhere, but not in the South. And the series aims to promote that. On our today's panel, we have individuals who have helped us better understand a certain breed of Arkansas traveler. On the one hand, broken new ground in African American women and Black activism and rural Arkansas on the other, and finally on broken new ground on Arkansas religious history. I want to turn the floor over to Kelly Jones, who will introduce our speakers, but first allow me the privilege of introducing you to Kelly if you don't already know her. She's, again, my new co-editor, who I'm sure will infuse the series with fresh energy and new ideas. She completed her MA thesis in Texas before figuring out where the future lay, and came to the University of Arkansas and completed her PhD under my direction on slavery in Arkansas, and has now published an award-winning book, A Weary Land, Slavery on the Ground in Arkansas. I'll just say one more thing about the book and yield the floor. It is a game changer in the history of slavery in Arkansas and also in the history of slavery. And it's destined to reshape the way we talk about the subject. Now, having my moment, allow me to turn over the proceedings to Dr. Jones. Dr. Jones, carry it away.
Thank you so much, and welcome everybody to this second session. There's a couple of things that I want to remind our attendees of, and that is that if you think of questions during the session that you would like our presenters to address, please post those in the chat feature. We'll also keep an eye on that Q&A in case you end up sticking them in there. Either one is fine. This session is being recorded, and so it'll be available eventually on the Arkansas Historical Association's YouTube channel. And the last thing to say is that there will be a survey that we really appreciate you helping us out with. If you'd fill that out when we're finished, and when you hit leave or you X out of the window for the Zoom webinar, that survey will automatically pop up, and that helps us with our grant funding and stuff like that. So anyway, back to the good stuff. The first of our presenters, and I'll run through all three of them together, and then we'll turn it over to them one by one. The first of our presenters is Dr. Andrew J. Milson, who's a professor of history and geography at the University of Texas at Arlington, where he's been since 2010. His roots, though, are in Arkansas. His ancestors settled in this state in the 1820s. His book, Arkansas Travelers, Geographies of Exploration and Perception, 1804 to 1834, was published in 2019 in this Arkansas History series and won the 2020 J.G. Ragsdale Book Award, awarded by, of course, the Arkansas Historical Association. His book offers a tour with William Dunbar, Thomas Nuttall, Henry Rose Schoolcraft, and George William Featherston as they explored the Arkansas frontier in the early 19th century. Each of these travelers wrote about the treacherous rivers, drunken scoundrels, humble dwellings, repulsive food, and beautiful vistas they encountered. Milson breaks new ground by offering detailed maps that illustrate the travelers' routes as well as their environmental and cultural perceptions. So one of the exciting functions of Milson's work is that it connects early Arkansas travelers with the still growing and still fairly young field of Southern environmental history. Cherisse Jones Branch, Dr. Cherisse Jones Branch is the James and Wanda Lee Vaughn Endowed Professor of History at Arkansas State University, and she's also Dean of the Graduate School. Her first book is Crossing the Line, Women and Interracial Activism in South Carolina During and After World War II, which was published by the University Press of Florida. Her second major project was co-editing Arkansas Women, Their Lives and Times, which was published by the University of Georgia Press. But today we're going to talk about and engage with her on her latest book, the first major study to consider Black women's activism in rural Arkansas, called Better Living by Their Own Bootstraps, which was published in this series in 2021. This book foregrounds activists' quest to improve Black communities through language and foodways, as well as politics and community organizing. Jones Branch reveals how educated middle-class women worked with their less educated rural sisters to create all-female spaces where they confronted several shared concerns. In her examination, Cherisse Jones Branch positions Black women squarely within Arkansas's and the South's agrarian history. And this is an incredibly understudied and exciting facet of Southern and African American history. And last but not least, we've got Dr. James Moses, recently retired, much to my dismay, recently retired from Arkansas Tech University, where he had taught for 22 years. He's a historian of the mid-20th century South with an emphasis on culture and the civil rights movement era. His book, Just and Righteous Causes, Rabbi Ira Sanders and the Fight for Racial and Social Justice in Arkansas, 1926 to 1963, was published in this series in 2018, and it won the 2019 Booker Worthen Prize from the Central Arkansas Library System. Just and Righteous Causes examines how deftly Rabbi Sanders navigated the intersections of race, religion, and gender to advocate for a more just society. Having arrived to Little Rock in the 1920s, it didn't take long for Rabbi Sanders to notice the tight hold of Jim Crow. And he also quickly jumped into leadership positions to combat that regime. Moses describes Ira Sanders as a, quote, bold social activist rabbi. So this book not only broke ground by adding to the relatively slim body of work on Arkansas's Jewish history, but it also adds to the relatively understudied history of the lives of Southern rabbis and the role of the Southern rabbi in the Jewish community throughout the political struggles of the mid-20th century South. So three very exciting books by three groundbreaking authors, and I'm going to turn it over first to Dr. Milson.
Okay, thank you to Dr. Jones and Dr. Whayne for organizing this session and for inviting me to participate. I will share my screen with you. I would like to just kind of, as a geographer, I like to show the visuals here. So let me switch the presenter view. Good old fun stuff here. Sorry about that. There we go. So I titled my session in keeping with the theme for the conference on identities, calling this Looking at the Gender Geographies of Arkansas Travelers. For those who aren't familiar with the book, it's called Arkansas Travelers, Geographies of Exploration and Perception. Recently, 2 episodes of Arts and Letters with J. Bradley Minnick on KUAR in Little Rock focused on, were conversations I had with Brad about 2 of the chapters from the book. So I put the links up here for those who are watching this video after the fact. You can click on those for your podcast pleasure. So the structure of the book basically is looking at 4 of the expeditions that came through Arkansas in this period between the Louisiana Purchase and the beginning of statehood in 1836. And so really what I was interested in doing was taking these lines on the map and trying to infuse a bit more understanding about the environmental and cultural perceptions that were evident in these travel narratives. And so looking at how I might map these to get us a little bit deeper perspective on what these men and their entourage had to say about Arkansas during this period of time. So for this presentation, I'll just quickly focus on one of these travelers, George Fenshaw, who did the latest of these expeditions in 1834. So quickly, Fenshaw, this is the long version of his journey from August of 1834 when he left Baltimore until January of 1835 when he returned back to Richmond, Virginia. But you can see he took a long tour through this whole southern part of the country and wrote a book entitled Excursion Through the Slave States that I drew the Arkansas portion from. So he essentially went down the Southwest Trail, the military road, from the northeast to the southwest of Arkansas, and then back, and then took the Arkansas River down from Little Rock. So to zoom in here, basically I tried to pull out some of the quotes from the book and from his narrative that focus on gender. And so I saw, particularly in this area of southwest Arkansas between Little Rock, and he crosses over the Red River into present day, actually it's Miller County, so it's not even present day Texas, even though he thought he was in Texas. But he describes some of the men that he encounters, the young men in Little Rock, as being outrageously bad, having, quarreling. He describes them as puppies, lacking in refinement, continually resorting to what they call the laws of honor. He talks about how they fire at each other with rifles across the street and dare each other with knives and so forth. He also, though, talks about what he refers to as a few respectable and agreeable individuals. So people we're familiar with in Arkansas history, John Pope and William Woodruff, uses words such as, worthy and industrious and so forth to describe these men. As he's heading down the military road from Little Rock to Washington, he stops in a few different, taverns and so forth along the way to spend the night. And one that is, I kind of figured it's near present day Benton, maybe, probably a little bit southwest of there. But he describes the owner of the tavern as a sort of she-Caliban, who of course is a reference to Shakespeare's Caliban monster in the Tempest. He describes a stunted, big-headed Negro girl that from her size did not appear to be more than 12, yet was not destined to see her 20th year. He complains about the wretched coffee, the heavy cakes, the fried little bits of fat pork, and so forth. A little bit further down the way, he stays with the Barkmans. I don't think Jacob Barkman was there, but this would be in Clark County, not far from Arkadelphia. And he describes Rebecca Davis Barkman as someone who he's never seen anyone with less pretensions to be classed with the feminine gender, that her accomplishments seem to have been decidedly leaning the other way. She chewed tobacco, smoked a pipe, drank whiskey, cursed, swore as heartily as any backwoodsman all at the same time. Yet, he also says, but she showed a good nature to us and made a great dinner, and so forth. Near Washington, he stayed with Judge Edward Cross and was impressed with the household and described Mrs. Cross as ladylike and agreeable, cooking an excellent supper. Certainly never did man feel more delighted at drawing the highest prize in the lottery than I did beholding 2 fine white linen sheets when he went to bed. Down near Spring Hill, he rides on horseback from Washington to Spring Hill with a man that he just refers to as Mr. Pryor. I think this is probably a man named Richard Pryor. He describes him as a Virginian who had moved into the neighborhood of Red River about 3 years before, had established a cotton plantation in Texas. He was gentlemanly and intelligent and wide awake, which he essentially was using that term to refer to him being very savvy about the land speculation and fraud. So that's a very quick look at just one of the travelers, but through all of them, I'm trying to draw out these cultural perceptions and then map them and look at some of the trends across those descriptions of place. And so if we look at gender geographies, we see some contrasting masculinities and femininities that are discussed in each one of these travelers' journals, but particularly with Fenshaw, described some men as honorable, respectable, industrious, refined, sober, prosperous, intelligent, aware, engaged in commerce, civilized, and worthy. Other men, he uses terms such as drunkard and scoundrel, scofflaw, bully, and so forth, indolent, disheveled, irreligious, ignorant, savage. So there's certainly a judgment on the masculinity of different men throughout this environment. But the women he describes I found particularly interesting because he uses terms like agreeable to describe women, that he approves of. And he seems to judge the women based on their household skill, how clean the place is, how comfortable the accommodations are, and how good the food is. He mocks or insults otherwise women that he finds unattractive, who lack household skill, or who possess, like Rebecca Barkman, what he refers to as manly manners. In keeping with our theme, I also see some intersections here, of course, in our social geographies. So there's a level of differing masculinities and femininities, but there's also what we can refer to as the imperial gaze in travel literature. So this is a common theme where you have people from the kinds of backgrounds that Fenshaw possesses approving of those that he thought were doing what they should be doing with the land, being commercially engaged or agricultural, and being critical of those who seemed incapable of capitalizing on these environmental blessings. And so this was very common across all 4 travelers in Arkansas, looking at the ways in which this land had such potential. Why aren't these people who live here making use of it? And those people receive some of the harshest judgments. There's also, of course, a class and a racial prejudice, a rejection of the poor, the non-white, those who are not involved in agriculture or commerce, and a national bias. 3 of the 4 men are Englishmen, Dunbar's Scottish, but Thomas Nuttall in particular was quite disapproving of the so-called habits of the French or the Canadians or the Métis settlers that he found throughout the space. So we can see those things intersecting with masculinities and femininities. So thank you very much. I will stop there and allow our next presenter to take over. And I'll wait for questions later. Thank you.
Good afternoon. I actually put together a very brief PowerPoint presentation. I don't want to share too terribly much because this is what I'm going to, can you see my presentation?
Yes.
Okay. I don't want to share too terribly much because I'm going to be talking about this on Friday, but I wanted to first start by thanking Kelly and Jeannie Whayne for inviting me to participate in this. I'm always glad to talk about my book because I had a great deal of fun writing it, but it also introduced some very different ways of thinking about how we do historical research, particularly when we're talking about people who aren't readily found in the archives. And so when I started working on this book, it actually was never intended to be a book. It was just a conference paper that I had given, and it just sort of started to take on a life of its own. I became really interested in rural lives and rural culture. And as a woman who comes from a mother who grew up on the Sea Islands of South Carolina, I understood that there was far more about rural life and rural culture than what I was seeing in the scholarship, namely that African-American lives were depressed and oppressed and traumatic. And I just determined that there had to be more to the story than that. And I started looking for it. Also, when I wrote my first book, I wrote about a Black woman civil rights activist who was also a home demonstration agent. And I didn't know what that was at the time. And so I wanted to find out what that was in the context of Arkansas. And I just started nosing around. And the final product was this book. Why did I start doing this? And how does this connect to this year's theme of gender and sexuality? I wanted to know more about rural Black women. And I also knew that there were other stories there that weren't being told. When I thought about rural Black women throughout the South and in Arkansas in particular, I knew their lives were more than just picking cotton all day long. Their jobs were not who they were. So it was really important to me to dig into those resources that I could put my hands on, most of which were not in the archives, that helped me figure out how to complicate their lives. And because no one had ever written a book about rural Black women's activism before, my best examples were books that have been written by my colleagues about white women in rural spaces in the United States, in the Midwestern United States, even in Canada, where I actually ended up giving a talk about rural Black women's activism. I went there and there was like 5 feet of snow on the ground, but I survived. And so what I discovered was that in many ways, their lives were very similar, except for the fact that these Black women were operating in the rural Jim Crow South, which made things a bit more difficult. So for example, I start by talking about home demonstration agents in Arkansas, and Mary L. Ray was the first African-American home demonstration agent in Arkansas. And she was a home demonstration agent in this state until about 1934 when she died. And I was very curious about what these agents did in these communities. At one point, I'd been told, oh, well, Black and white agents did the same thing. And I said, that's not possible because number one, the Agricultural Extension Service was segregated. And number two, these Black women have to navigate a racial and sexual minefield. So how is it that they were able to do what they did for these Black communities in the face of that danger, not only to their psyches, but also to their physical body? So what kind of navigating and negotiating did they have to do in order to do that? I was also curious about what kind of lessons were they imparting to Black women in home demonstration club meetings, for instance. Those were segregated as well. And so someone told me, well, in home demonstration club meetings, they talked about canning tomatoes and corns. And I've said this too many times in public, but that ain't all that interesting. So I was very curious about delving into what other kinds of conversations they had. And in reading the records from the Extension Service, because they were segregated, I had to read them carefully to really glean some of the other messages that they were being taught. But at times, the information was right there on the page. So for example, when they talk about things like family health, they were talking about things like relationships between men and women, husbands and wives. They were talking about things like how to obtain birth control. These were very important discussions that they were having within these home demonstration club meetings while they're canning tomatoes or corn. They're talking about things like mental health. They're talking about things like how to avoid getting a venereal disease, the types of things that we don't imagine that women are talking about in these home demonstration club meetings. These are the very things that they're talking about. I was also told that there wouldn't be any evidence of political activism in home demonstration club meetings, and that was wrong as well, because if you're having a discussion about someone paying poll taxes or how to pay poll taxes or creating a mock election or talking about the United Nations after World War II, then you or someone is helping you to imagine yourself as a citizen at a time and a place in this country where it was probably dangerous for you to do that. So that activism, whether you actually get to cast a ballot or not, was very obvious from what I was able to ascertain. So these home demonstration club meetings and these agents were very important, but they weren't the only ones that were operating in these rural communities. Also in these communities are relatively well-educated women like Jean's industrial supervising teachers. And I'll say more about this on Friday, but these are educated Black women. They didn't all start out as Black women, but they're educated Black women working in rural communities to help improve educational access. So on the one hand, because they're working in rural communities with African Americans who labor on white land, the idea, at least from the perspective of white school administrators, is to teach them the basic reading, writing, and arithmetic. But that's not all they're doing, because when they're outside of the white gaze, they're talking to them about political activism and community uplift and rural uplift. And the other thing that I think is important here is that this is not a narrative about Black people encouraging other Black people to leave the South and go north or west. People did that on their own, of course, but a lot of the rhetoric is about ways to remain in the South and to not only survive, but to also thrive. And that's important because not all of these people are sharecroppers. They may be agricultural laborers, but they may very well be laboring on land that they actually own. So it was very important to me to really rip apart this standing narrative that we've had about rural Black lives and to understand it in more complicated and nuanced ways. One point that I want to end on, because as I said, I don't want to give all of my talk away, is that I think it's really important for us to understand that rural Black women were political activists. They may have been agricultural laborers, and they may have performed all other sorts of occupations, but again, their work is not all that they were. And this is a classic example of Annie Zachary Pike. She later remarried, who was an agricultural laborer, but she and her husband owned their land and they had sharecroppers working for them. Miss Annie, as she's most commonly known, she's in her 90s, she's still very much alive. She was a political activist. She campaigned for Winthrop Rockefeller. When he was elected governor of Arkansas, he appointed her to the Arkansas Welfare Board, and she went on herself to run for the Arkansas State Senate in 1922. And she did all of this, if you can't see this on this slide here, as a member of the Republican Party. So again, we're talking about the late 1960s, early 1970s, when we have certain kinds of assumptions about how African Americans in the South are politically affiliated. What we find here very quickly is that that may not have necessarily been the case. And in fact, it wasn't the case in a place like Arkansas. And just on this last slide that I want to show you here, simply because you won't be able to see this on Friday night, is if you look at everything that Miss Annie had done, she worked with the 4-H, she worked with the Farm Bureau, she worked with the Arkansas Association of Colored Women. I mean, she was a community activist in addition to being a farm woman. And even after she ran for the Arkansas State Senate and lost, she remained involved in Arkansas Republican Party politics, probably until about the early to mid 1970s. But the bigger point for me is that when we look at these kinds of histories, we have to think creatively about how we're going to access these stories, because much of this information was not available in traditional archives. The stuff on agricultural extension clubs was, on agricultural extension service agents, but in the case of Annie Zachary Pike, this is the only document, one of two documents actually that I found in an archives here in Arkansas. Everything else was in her house. So that meant that in order to access that kind of information, you have to think very differently about the relationships you form with the people who possess these resources. It wasn't a matter of going into the archive and looking at a finding aid and requesting a box and a folder. It was, however, a matter of developing a very strong relationship with this individual, with her family, and with her community. It was also a matter of leveraging resources that some other people might not have. Some of the organizations that she's still a member of to this day, I'm a member of those organizations. So I was able to utilize my organizational affiliations as evidence of all the things that we had in common. And so in looking at the lives of rural Black women, we have to be mindful of the different sorts of strategies we have to utilize to get at this information. It's not always in the archives. It may be in a barn, or it may be in a back room someplace, or as in the case of Annie Zachary Pike, it was in these huge, big plastic Rubbermaid barrels that she had kept in her back room for decades upon decades. I think it's also important, this is the last thing that I want to say on this, is that we think differently about rural Black lives and rural history, and think about the ways that we can get at the stories of institutional building, organizational building, land ownership, the ways that rural Black life survived and thrived, rather than the more traumatic aspects of that life, because there's more to the story than that. And I hope my book demonstrates that. Thank you.
I think we're ready.
Oh, me? I'm on?
You're on.
Okay. Sorry about that. Hi, everybody. I first want to say thanks to Jeannie, Whayne, and Kelly Jones. Thanks a lot for asking me to be a part of this. It's fun. And to Drs. Jones, Branch, and Milson, nice to be with you. I'm here to talk about, obviously, the book that I wrote in 2018, which addresses the work and life, to a degree, of a rabbi named Ira Sanders, who worked for racial and social justice across the mid-20th century in central Arkansas. He was a transplanted rabbi, and did his work during some of the worst traumas in the state's history, natural disaster, of course, the economic catastrophe of the Great Depression, and then the racial strife and injustice in mid-century, and the lack of rights and access for Arkansas women to reproductive freedom. His activism touches in all of these areas. And so through this story, it was my hope to show the evolution in general of social justice in Arkansas across the mid-20th century. So in essence, my book is a history through biography, okay? Now, Sanders will emerge as a pivotal figure in the Little Rock area from the mid-20s. He arrived in September of 26, through the 60s in these areas. And at that time, and you know, our conference here is about identity, specifically gender, sexuality, but identity broadly written. And in the time that Sanders was here as a transplant, born in Missouri, came here from New York City, but came very quickly to fully identify himself, not as Missourian or a New Yorker, but as an Arkansan, embracing that identity and seeking to instill in others the same pride and hope for the future of the state that he held. So in large part, my story is the story of Sanders, the community activist, and his good works in Arkansas. It's a story of identity, okay? His own, the rights of African Americans to full personhood, the educating of Arkansas whites toward that end, toward tolerance, not tolerance, that's a word he abhorred, acceptance of racial equality, of women being able to have control of their own reproductive choices, their own bodies. This he accomplished both on a large and small scale, changing the lives of individuals, to be sure, and in doing so, impacting what I believe, at least, impacting the very trajectory of history in Central Arkansas over the course of the 20th century. So I'll talk about some of these things and pay particular attention to the questions of gender and sexuality in Arkansas women that are raised in my book, okay? Just very quickly though, Sanders arrives in Little Rock in September of 26, really hot day. He didn't think he would stay. In fact, he had to be talked into staying. But he did, once he did decide to stay, he was determined to make a difference. Now, Sanders was a social worker as well as a rabbi. And he was guided by the words of Isaiah: learn to do well, seek justice, relieve the oppressed. He built his life around this. On top of that, with a degree in sociology from Columbia Graduate School, studying under such figures as John Dewey, working alongside social work pioneer Lillian Wald at the famous Henry Street Settlement House in New York. He brought all this with him to Little Rock and came to love the state and to be embraced by the state, particularly by the city of Little Rock as a beloved city father. He brought with him his experience and his hopes of transforming the state from a poor rural backwater without a lot of social services to a modern state replete with such services. And to a degree, he succeeded in that. Now, as to our theme, the conference theme of gender and sexuality, Sanders likewise had an enormous impact on the lives of Central Arkansas women and families. So let's begin in the Depression era with the twin catastrophes of drought and economic collapse that brought enormous pressures on Arkansas women and families, touching the most intimate aspects of their lives, you know, their sex lives, the lives of their children, okay? And to ameliorate this, to ameliorate the lives of Arkansas women in particular, Sanders created a number of public service agencies. For the Jewish community, the Arkansas Jewish Assembly, the Jewish Welfare Fund, which aided that community, the Family Welfare Agency of Little Rock, which provided aid to poor families. Most importantly, the Pulaski County Public Welfare Commission, which he created and ran in the early 1930s. And to serve the cause of racial justice, he was a founder of the Little Rock Urban League, actually called the Urban League of Greater Little Rock. A lot of other stuff as well. All of this while serving as a rabbi of a large congregation, running the School of Social Work, which he founded the year he arrived, and serving on the boards of who knows how many, well, about 20 different agencies, okay? He was an utterly tireless individual. Again, to concentrate on the themes that we're addressing here, let's talk about his formative work in creating what was called the Arkansas Eugenics Association, which sounds ominous, but it's not. And its accompanying entity, the Little Rock Birth Control Clinic, founded in 1931 with Little Rock activist Hilda Cornish. Now, let me say a little bit about Hilda Cornish, prominent activist in the city, founder of the Little Rock Playground Association, well-respected, upper-class club woman, widow of a prominent banker. She led volunteer efforts in the wake of the 27 Mississippi River flood. She was later president of the Central Council of Social Agencies, which had been headed by Sanders, Arkansas Federation of Women's Clubs. She was a close friend of Margaret Sanger's. All right, their sons roomed together at Yale. She is, by the way, to those of you listening, she would be an excellent subject for a book in the Arkansas history series. So somebody out there, get on it. Hilda Cornish. Sanders settled on the name Arkansas Eugenics Association to create some distance from the controversial work of Margaret Sanger, who had coined the term birth control, as we know, and whose work was a point of great controversy. The public perception was that birth control, all right, was the province of radicals, particularly women radicals, social activists, all right, while eugenics had this the sound of a male-dominated scientific endeavor. So the very name that Sanders chose for the organization is a kind of gendered analysis to give the birth control clinic a little cover, and it succeeded. No one ever labeled Hilda Cornish or Ira Sanders as radicals, all right? They were insulating the birth control clinic from controversy. So this was, in some ways, a bit of gender politics at work to camouflage the true work of the Eugenics Association, which pure and simple was access to birth control for poor women. The clinic was the only one in the state for more than 10 years, and it offered services to poor married white women. But by 1937, opened its doors to Black women as well, providing them with the same information and the same devices, such as diaphragms and spermicidal jellies and such. For Sanders and Cornish, birth control was an effective anti-poverty device as well. Fewer children, fewer mouths to feed, less burden on families, on women, but also on the state's capacity to care for the poor, particularly during these first years of the Great Depression, the worst years. In 1942, the Eugenics Association became Planned Parenthood of Arkansas, again headed by Ira Sanders. It was following the lead of Sanger's Brooklyn-based American Birth Control League, which had also changed its name to the Planned Parenthood Federation. Sanders was the president and not very good. A terrific inspirational leader, not a very good businessman. And the organization in Arkansas folded in 1955. Cornish and Sanders were, you know, after the organization folded, they were still busy at work, taking calls from women and referring them to physicians. So this work was to combat poverty, but was also to offer women a measure of choice in their lives about whether or not they would have children, okay? When Sanders took, and probably one of the things that Sanders is most famous for, and I'll wrap up with this, is his work during the Central High crisis, where he went before the state Senate and testified, you know, braving death threats and bomb threats and any other kind of threat to life and limb you can think of in 1957 to speak in favor of school integration and to oppose the anti-integration bills about to be passed. He spoke also about his own evolved sense of himself. His identity as an Arkansan, okay? He spoke about his concerns about the way Arkansas identity would be perceived nationwide, you know, should these bills be passed in 1957. Of course, they were. In his words, his concern was that Arkansas would become a state held morally in just opprobrium, right? He said, the state of Arkansas is very dear to me. It's provided me the opportunity to serve many causes in social welfare. So he had certainly, by the time of the Little Rock crisis, come to identify fully as an Arkansan. And his work, which continued well past his retirement in 1963, left a lasting mark on the evolution of the state and its institutional responses to both racism and women's rights. He had evolved from a transplanted New Yorker who had to be talked into staying in 1926 to a man who fully threw himself into the social welfare causes of his adopted state. And he came to love the state of Arkansas. His works particularly involved the status of Arkansas women, fight for birth control rights, reproductive freedom. And from Sanders' activities, and this is the last word, I think, we can learn from his struggles and get a sense of the broader picture of the evolution of social justice across Arkansas's mid-20th century. Okay, thanks. Thanks for your attention. Thanks for inviting me. And now I think we're going to have questions.
Right. So my job here, what I'm going to do is I will, if you'll post your questions for our presenters, I will sort of scroll up here to the top and I'll start at the top. And what we'll do is when I call you and say like, hey, I'm pretty sure this one's for Andrew or this, this one's for Cherisse, then if you'll unmute and address the question. I think our first one's popped in the Q&A feature actually. So I'm going to go in there first. And we've got some comments. And then I've got a question here from Wendy Plotkin. And it says, great presentation. I assume there was tension associated with the need to avoid triggering white anger and unleashing penalties for activists up to and including lynching. And I believe that's for Cherisse, and I believe the second one is too. So I'm going to hit you with both of these, Cherisse, and I think they're related. Did the male relatives of the activists demonstrate ambivalence about the activism because they might be the recipient of whites' anger?
Well, absolutely. But I think they also understood that these women, these Black women, had better protection sometimes because they were women. And that's problematic, right? Because that's not necessarily the case, and all women aren't regarded the same, and so on and so forth. So yeah, I think there was clearly some concern about that. To the other point, someone was asked, what was the other question again? I'm sorry, I already forgot.
The other question was about that danger for activists.
Okay.
The second one.
Gotcha.
Okay. They're related questions.
Yeah. Racial violence on the whole was always in these women's minds. They may not have had to worry about lynching and lynching in the traditional sense where someone's hanging from a tree or whatever, but as Black women, they certainly had to be concerned about sexual violence. So the danger is always there.
Thank you. The chat is active, so y'all hang on here with me for just a second. I'm going to scroll down here to, okay, this one is for Dr. Milson. What were the economic differences during this part of history rather than the social differences?
Okay, yeah, so I, in some ways, kind of think of the economic landscape being a part of that social landscape, but certainly vast differences in wealth and poverty throughout the state as newcomers are the people that were named here were individuals who were more wealthy and well connected. People like my ancestors who settled there and were inhabiting the same space and time as Jacob Barkman and Edward Cross. But we certainly don't have any, photos or information about them as poor farmers. So Yeah, I mean, so I'm not an expert in the economic history of the period, but I certainly saw that as one of the ways in which, these men of fairly privileged backgrounds were casting judgments about the people. And one of the things I'll just say is, I didn't say it in the presentation, but, I don't take what they said on face value as evidence of what Arkansas was like at that time. I look at it as, this is what these people had to say. And in many ways, it says more about them than it does about the people they were judging. But I used it as a way to understand the kind of place characteristics that these men were bringing about through their dialogue. What kinds of ideas were evident in their dialogue. So hope that answered your question.
Nicely put. There is another one for you, and they're in the same chat bubble. So I'm going to throw yours to you, then I'm going to throw Cherisse's to her, and then when you're finished, we'll have her pop on.
Sounds good.
So the first one is, this is from Darren Bell, 2 questions. The first one is, Andrew, is there evidence of the 4 travelers using male descriptive terms for women and vice versa? And then when you're satisfied with your response to that, we'll go to Cherisse, and she's going to tell us, did the African-American agents ever discuss better cost-efficient ways to construct farm buildings?
Yeah, so I think the example of Rebecca Barkman is a good one for kind of when these men were disapproving of the appearance of women, they might describe them as manly, and so, or big boned, or something like that. Some of these sort of in things that they intended as an insult. I'd have, that wasn't really what I was analyzing as I was going through, so I'd have to kind of go back and see. But that's a really great question to sort of dig a little bit more deeply into how gender was portrayed by these men. So I'll toss it over to Cherisse.
Yes, absolutely. A lot of this was about home improvement, but it wasn't just about improving your farm just for the sake of improving your farm or the house or whatever. For many of these people, improving communities, improving your farms or whatever, it was tantamount to racial uplift as well. So if we improve this, if we do that, they'll see us in these different sorts of ways. Also, it connects to political activism in this way. For many of them, the understanding was you can't be politically viable until you have demonstrated yourself in these ways. It has to start here. And then you can maybe get to a point where you go cast a ballot or something like that. So a lot of it was about the white gaze, right? If you improve and uplift yourself in these ways, and these people won't think of us in this way, something that should have never ever mattered in the first place, except that it did at the time. And also these home demonstration agents and others, but home demonstration agents in particular, they are doing this sometimes without the information that white home demonstration agents were getting. So for example, I know a lot of the University of Arkansas Extension Service circulars have been digitized and they're on a website somewhere over there. At the time, Black home demonstration agents and Black farm agents, for that matter, would not have always had equal access to that information. So I think under the circumstances, what they were able to do was pretty remarkable.
Thanks so much. We are taking care of these. So as I'm scrolling down, I see one in the chat bubble that I'm not completely sure I understand. So I'm going to give Suzanne Huff a chance to clarify that. It says that this one is for Moses. How do you understand birth control that is unfolding in Oklahoma? So that might be a question about sort of recent politics. I'm going to ask you a question that I selfishly would like answered about the birth control issue as well, and then we'll see. We'll let Suzanne sort of clarify exactly what she's wanting you to engage with there. I'm really curious about the so if the rabbi is providing leadership for this avenue for accessing birth control, are there women from the congregation also involved in this, or sort of how acceptable is this effort in the Jewish community, or is he sort of an outlier in this, or are the Jewish women in his congregation behind him and active in that as well?
There, should unmute before I start talking. Yeah, not an outlier at all. He always had the assistance of strong women, both in the congregation and then out in the community as well. A woman named Ora Nix, N-I-X, and of course Hilda Cornish, who was a very prominent Little Rock activist. And so, you know, I think the answer to the question is that he always had, regardless of the level of controversy that Sanders sort of cloaked himself with, and it was a lot, you know, given the fact that, well, for example, in 1926, actually, yeah, 1926, he's trying to break down segregation on the streetcars by sitting in the back of a trolley. In 1931, he's founding a birth control clinic in an era when birth control was considered alongside pornographic material as something to be, you know, legislated against. So the support was always there. It's one of the remarkable things about his story is the level of support that he had. And in terms of the birth control clinic and the whole eugenics association writ large, he always had the support of congregational women and always had the assistance of women in the community with this. So now, as to Oklahoma, I have no idea. I'm sorry.
All right, so I've got two for Dr. Jones' branch. One is in the chat and one's in the Q&A, and I'm going to hit you with both. From Dr. Valandra, I'm curious how long it took you to write your book, given the efforts you had to put in to access sources of information and incorporating oral history interviews.
Well, I'll just say that I'm glad I wasn't dean at the time.
You're glad, oh yeah, right.
But it maybe 5 or 6 years, but it really was a labor of love because it was so important to me that this book be written. And it was interesting all the places that I was able to find information once I started looking, and also assuming that Black women's voices would be present in these spaces. A lot of times things are overlooked because people can't imagine that Black women, and especially rural Black women, would be doing certain things or would be involved in certain kinds of things. But if you look, they almost always are. And so that is what guided me. And also, when you start talking to people about Black home demonstration agents, things of that sort, people will start leading you to sources. They'll say, oh, well, I was in a home, and you know, my mother-in-law, she started talking about, I was in a home demonstration agent and Miss Sylvianne Mays showed me how to do this. Well, Sylvianne Mays is one of the women I mentioned briefly in my book. So people will start talking to you about this. Also, they'll start talking to you after you've published the book, right? Because I gave a talk at a place in Little Rock. It was Pyramid Arts and Books in Little Rock. It was a Black-owned art gallery and bookstore. And you can see the cover of my book in the background there. But one of those women, her 2 grown children came up to me and said, well, this is my mother and this is about my mom. And I'm looking at them like, thanks, but where were you, you know, a year ago when I really could have used all this? I mean, you know, I wasn't ugly about it like that, but now people are coming out of the woodworks and saying, oh, well, this was my grandmother, this was my aunt, this was my so-and-so. So I had to do quite a bit of digging, which I was happy to do. It's what I was trained to do, but I sure wish I'd met some of these people before.
I bet you, like me, I've had that experience too, Cherisse. I bet you're making notes on all this. You never know when you'll have an opportunity to do a new edition or write a different book. Or
absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, people just, yes, all over the world. I knew so-and-so and I have this over here. Well, where have you been? But anyway, yes.
Thank you so much. And I'm looking at the time. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to turn it back to Jeannie Whayne, who got us started, and let her thank everybody and kind of sign us off and do a little commercial for this series.
Thank you very much, Kelly, for running the show here. It was great. You did a fabulous job. I was watching that feed too and wondering how to make that all come together, and I'm glad that you did it. Anyway, thank you all very much. It was the great presentations. You did exactly what we had hoped you'd do, as bring out the issue of gender. Of course, Cherisse had it made on that one, but Andrew and James, that was just terrific. We appreciate you, and look forward to seeing more of you. And I wish you were going to be there a Saturday night, so or Friday night. So I better come the right night, right? But anyway, okay. Thank you very, very much, and we'll let you all go now.
Thanks, y'all.
Thank you. Bye-bye.